And in news coming in right now, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping this Saturday. He sat down to talks with President Xi in the Great Hall of the People. This, of course, after the U.S. looks to tighten economic sanctions aimed at persuading North Korea to retreat from its nuclear and missile tests. Earlier today, Mr. Tillerson met with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing as well. Now, remember, the President Donald Trump has repeatedly urged his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping to exert more economic pressure on Pyongyang. Though at the moment, China has strongly responded by backing the UNSC sanctions against Pyongyang. But of course, Mr. Tillerson's visit to China throws up more questions on how exactly the U.S. plans on dealing with the North Korean crisis. And to help us get a better perspective on Mr. Tillerson's visit and, of course, the whole North Korea question, I'm joined by my colleague Sana Khan from the Wion newsroom. Sana, what's the latest we have? Has Mr. Tillerson made any sort of statement indicating the United States, let's say, its plan towards North Korea given the standoff right now?
Aisha, what we do know as of now is that Rex Tillerson is in China, and he has said that the United States is in contact with North Korea. This perhaps has come, could likely be a big breakthrough in case, talks were to bring out some sort of a solution in the days to come. But it also seems in the larger scheme of things that the US's tactic of pressurizing China to exert pressure in turn on its closest ally, North Korea, is concerned, that seems to be very clearly working at this point in time, because Rex Tillerson went to China and the main purpose of his visit was just that, to exert maximum pressure on China to make sure that North Korea is on board, at least is ready for talks, some headway over there. Now, again, Tillerson has, as you pointed out, met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping earlier today. So all seems to be going well. And it'll be interesting to see to what extent China is able to pressurize the North at this point in time, because as things stand now, North Korea, there have been really no signs to say or to suggest that North Korea is kind of taking a step back from its nuclear program for the moment. But for now, it seems to me that it's a little headway and perhaps could be the premise of a solution that we could expect in the next few weeks or months.
Absolutely, and perhaps even the smallest headway in this sort of a conflict can have larger overtones. In fact, just today, South Korea going out and saying that it's concerned about the North continuing with more nuclear tests or missile tests in the weeks to come. In that sense, Sana, do you think that even, the suggestion of the United States being open for talks is in some ways the slightest glimmer of hope, the slightest idea that the simmering tension might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel?
Right, so Aisha, it all really depends on what Rex Tillerson is able to achieve in China. This is a very positive sign, what we're hearing of possibility of talks that would already be going on between Seoul and Washington. But Rex Tillerson very clearly has two challenges as far as he himself is concerned to broker peace at this point. And those are tough challenges. A would be to somehow convince the North Korean regime that the nuclear program is, it's not adding to its strength, but in fact it's creating tension on the Korean peninsula, and it's best to abandon it. It's not an asset, perhaps a liability if you look at the peace in the region. And the second most important point is to pressure, a challenge would be to pressure China into being very harsh when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to North Korea's economy, trade, to cut off trade to such an extent that North Korea really gets a very hard-hitting message saying that if China cuts off trade with us, then economically we will be left nowhere. So I think these 2 points are very important. If Rex Tillerson is able to convey these messages, which seems very difficult at this point, then that would be one of the biggest successes or a breakthrough in this present crisis.
Stay with me, Sana. Just to remind our viewers of the story we're tracking right now, the United States Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is in fact in China. We're hearing suggestions that Mr. Tillerson has indicated that the United States is in talks with North Korea. This, of course, the first real admission by Washington on any sort of dialogue going on with North Korea. Remember, the U.S. has been aggressively pushing for more sanctions against North Korea ever since this crisis between the two states reached fever pitch. I'm joined on the phone line by Mr. M.D. Nalapat. He's, of course, a strategic affairs analyst and also an expert, as it were, on China. Mr. Nalapat, thanks very much for speaking with us here at Wion. If we are to believe that the United States is, open to this whole concept of dialogue with North Korea, looking at Mr. Tillerson's statement, does this prove to be at least some sort of simplification to the simmering tension between Washington and Pyongyang?
Look, I don't believe it's going to be, for the simple reason the U.S. concept of dialogue, at least in this case, is basically that the North Koreans agree to what they say in advance. And dialogue is basically a kind of a diplomatic way of sugarcoating that particular agreement. The North Koreans are not going to agree to give up their nuclear and missile program because they are very, very clear that if they do that, the regime is going to be helpless in the face of U.S. retaliation. So frankly, this is a dialogue that is going to go nowhere.
All right. Can I ask you this as well? We were talking about the challenges that Mr. Tillerson faces on this trip. Do you think one of them is the United States President himself? Because Mr. Tillerson in the past has made certain statements, as have different members of Mr. Trump's team, but those have sort of been nullified by tweets and other statements that have followed. So can we really take Mr. Tillerson's statements as, let's say, even a suggestion of policy when the President in the past has indicated otherwise?
Well, you're quite right. The president eventually sets policy. But I think the U.S. Bureaucracy has adjusted to a system in which, frankly, Donald Trump says and tweets what he likes. And they basically do what they like. I think there's now a clear disconnect between U.S. policy as actually carried out and Donald Trump's tweets and statements. The two are now becoming more and more separated from each other. So I wouldn't worry about that. The only problem is now, you have a situation, for example, in which the Trump administration is on the verge of tearing up the agreement with Iran. Now, you are tearing up a nuclear agreement with a country. You have broken agreements, frankly, with Gaddafi. You have finished off Saddam Hussein after he surrendered his WMD. In that kind of situation, I don't think Kim Jong-un will have, frankly, much trust in the United States. That's why from day one, in my view, these talks are going to be absolutely a non-starter.
All right, so perhaps all of this might come to moot, but can we also see Mr. Tillerson's visit, Mr. Tillerson's statements as a bit of setting of the ground ahead of President Trump's upcoming 11-day tour to Asia?
Well, I think Mr. Tillerson and his Chinese host will definitely want to ensure that there's a good visit, because China now regards itself as part of the G2. And China now compares itself with no other country except the United States. At the same time, next month there's an important leadership conference in which the people who are going to run China for the next 5 years are going to be selected. So from that point of view, a good visit is important. It's also important to Donald Trump to show that he's a global statesperson. So yes, that particular part of the agenda, in my view, a lot of progress is going to be made so that Trump has a good visit with lots of good optics. But so far as North Korea is concerned, neither China nor the United States have really any even moderately good options regarding North Korea.
Right. Professor Nalapat, stay with me, please. I've got Ambassador Vishnu Prakash joining us on the broadcast as well. Good evening, Ambassador. Thanks very much for speaking with us here at Wion. If I can just ask you to, comment on the suggestion that the United States is, in fact, in dialogue with North Korea. Does this prove to be any sort of change to the status quo, or is it really just the voicing of something that we'll have to wait and watch to see if there's really an outcome of?
I've also seen the report. Further details are awaited, which may or may not come into the public domain. But I have two comments. One, I'm not surprised at all. And secondly, it's a positive development if indeed there have been contacts between Pyongyang and Washington. In fact, it is very common in the diplomatic world for back channels to be always be in contact with each other, or track two dialogues to continue. And it has been known in the past that Washington has used the permanent mission of North Korea in New York as a channel of communication. And frankly, dialogue is the only way forward, despite the public position that has been taken by both sides. And if USA indeed has taken the initiative, it is the right thing to do. It's a positive and welcome development.
Sir, but, you know, I want to ask you, does this particular crisis, the one between Washington and Pyongyang, stand out in some way from, you know, others, regular sort of diplomatic crises, given the heads of state that we're talking about, given the fact that this is President Donald Trump, who doesn't seem to really prescribe to the usual tactics of diplomacy, and on the other hand, Kim Jong-un?
Well, in North Korea, the bellicosity, the acerbic language that North Koreans have used, or the flowery language that they have used, the aggressive tone that they have used, has always been the case. That is how North Korea conducts its diplomacy. President Trump taking to the Twitter or commenting directly is a new development. But the challenge remains the same. The challenge basically is the rapid development of WMD technology that North Korea has. And the issue is to somehow contain that challenge. Now, we all know that perhaps North Korea has crossed the threshold and denuclearization of North Korea will be difficult. So what is the option? The option is to contain the challenge, to freeze the development, to allow international monitoring, and that can only be done through talks. So while there has been a public position taken that no, we will not talk, we demand this and that is posturing that which sides take. They stake out a claim on both sides, and that's the maximalist positions that are taken. But then you have to start a dialogue, and who starts a dialogue? No, it is always good diplomacy for the stronger side to initiate the dialogue. And that is what North Korea seeks. So if indeed a process has been initiated, I think that is would be the first step towards an effort to diffuse tensions between the two countries and engage in a meaningful, constructive and direct dialogue between the two sides.